Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing and clicking the notification bell. You can also support me on Patreon, link is in the description, as well as a link to my social media, my blog, and all that stuff. In March 1921, there was a mutiny against the Soviet government among soldiers in the fortress town of Kronstadt. The mutiny went on for 2 weeks until it was suppressed by the Bolshevik government. The Kronstadt mutiny is one of those topics which is always debated. Was it a heroic uprising against the tyrannical Bolsheviks, or was it an attempt at counter-revolution? Before I started researching this topic, I thought that the Kronstadt mutiny was basically just a silly anarchistic action, but it's actually much worse than that, as we will see in a moment. The lasting myth of Kronstadt. The Kronstadt mutiny has remained a topic of discussion to this day. That is because it is always used as an example of supposed communist tyranny by anarchists and revisionists, but also by capitalists and imperialists. They all claim that since the communists had to suppress a mutiny, therefore it somehow proves that they were anti-worker, oppressive, and that they had turned against their own revolution. Of course, this is purely stupidity, simplistic thinking, and pure demagogy. Of course, there were other revolts and plots against the Bolsheviks too, but the Kronstadt mutiny works much better for anarchist and capitalist propaganda purposes, because at least on the surface it was done by soldiers, of mostly peasant origin, and not by the rich capitalists or aristocrats, and because at least on the surface it had a left-wing agenda. However, the surface appearance doesn't necessarily reflect the whole truth. The first capitalist president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, the most hated Russian leader in known history, praised the Kronstadt mutiny and opened the archives for researchers so that they could prove how heroic the mutiny was and how evil the Bolsheviks were. Unfortunately, this effort backfired, since the primary source evidence that he released doesn't support his conclusions at all. The opened archives contain more than 1,000 documents, which include first-hand accounts by mutineers, secret White Guard reports, articles, memoirs, etc., collected from a range of Soviet, White Guard, Menshevik, anarchist, and Western capitalist sources. We will look at a bunch of those sources in a moment. When the mutiny broke out, it was immediately praised and supported in the capitalist media. Actually, it was already praised and supported in the capitalist media 2 weeks before it had even broken out. This already shows that the mutiny was organized, or at least sponsored and supported by capitalists and Western imperialist countries. Leader of the mutiny, Petrichenko. The leader of the mutiny was a political adventurer named Stepan Petrichenko. He had been in the Red Army, but considered himself an anarcho-syndicalist. He was also a Ukrainian nationalist. Petrichenko apparently remained an anarcho-syndicalist, at least on the surface, for most of his life. But 1 year before the Kronstadt mutiny, he had actually tried to join the White Army. This was actually pointed out by an anarchist historian, by the way, so don't claim, oh, you're just a Stalinoid, you're making this up. No, an anarchist historian said this. So, this is what the anarchist historian Avrich writes. Quote, Petrichenko returned to his native village in April 1920 and apparently remained there until September or October. The authorities, that's the Soviet authorities, he later told an American journalist, had arrested him more than once on suspicion of counter-revolutionary activity. He had even tried to join the Whites. Unquote. This anarchist historian Avrich discovered a White Guard memorandum on the question of organizing an uprising in Kronstadt, which is quite interesting. So already pretty quickly after the events in Kronstadt, we had absolutely solid proof that the leaders and organizers of the mutiny were either White Guards themselves or were working with White Guardists. And now, today, with the archival materials, even with the memorandum that Avrich found and all that other stuff, we have absolutely mountains of further evidence that the mutiny was organized by White Guards and people who were collaborating with White Guards. and if anyone says otherwise, they're either ignorant, perhaps willfully ignorant, or they're lying. They might say that the original Cheka investigation, which was carried out like a day after the mutiny, they said they didn't find any conclusive proof that the mutiny wasn't spontaneous. Sometimes anarchists will say, well, see, even the Cheka concluded that the mutiny was just spontaneous. Well, first of all, the Cheka, like a day after the mutiny or 2 days after the mutiny, they didn't even have all the facts yet, because it takes time to figure out what actually happened, and later they discovered exactly what happened. So just because the Cheka didn't immediately figure out everything, doesn't mean that the White Guard wasn't involved. So it's just a fallacy. They're ignoring all the evidence on purpose. And second of all, of course there was a spontaneous element. There were people who were just spontaneously pissed off, but the White Guards managed to take advantage of the situation and hijack the situation and escalate the situation, but we'll get more into that. How the mutiny was organized. In 1921, Russia was in ruins after years of World War I and Civil War. Fuel and food were always extremely scarce. As long as the Civil War lasted, the population basically understood and tolerated all these hardships. They understood that it was inevitable in the war. However, in 1921, the war was coming to an end. Massive amounts of soldiers were sent home from the Red Army, or at least taken away from battle. This created disturbances, as people were no longer focused on fighting the White Army, and there were lots of basically, badly adjusted, jobless soldiers wandering around. Peasants also began opposing the wartime policy of grain requisition at fixed prices, and most of the soldiers themselves were peasants. This all combined together to create some spontaneous disturbances. The policy of the government was to evaluate the situation, change from war policies to peacetime policies, and organize the reconstruction of the country and revitalization of the economy. However, that was an extremely difficult task, which couldn't simply be completed in one day. There was unrest in Petrograd after several factories were closed down due to fuel shortages. Some Menshevik counter-revolutionaries were arrested without bloodshed. False rumors of workers being shot and factories even being bombed in Petrograd were spread in the fortress town of Kronstadt. Reactionaries took full advantage of these rumors and spread them. Avrich writes, quote, "Mingled with the initial reports was an assortment of bogus rumors, which quickly roused the passion of the sailors. It was said, for example, that government troops had fired on the Vasily Island demonstrators and that strike leaders were being shot in the cellars of the Cheka," unquote. And, quote, "The Petrograd strikes were on the wane, but the rumors of shootings and full-scale rioting had already aroused the sailors, and on March 2nd, at a time when the disturbances had all but ceased, they were drafting the erroneous announcement for publication the following day that the city was in the throes of a general insurrection," unquote. All these lies and rumors were a necessary ideological preparation for the mutiny. A mass meeting was held in Kronstadt on March 1st, where anti-communist statements and lies were spread. Basically, spread lies about the government, say, oh, the government is bombing workers, the government is arresting workers, blah blah blah, to try to turn the population of Kronstadt against the government. The meeting was orchestrated in such a way that communists were not allowed to speak. The topic was raised that new elections to the Soviet should be carried out. A delegate meeting of soldiers was held the next day on March 2nd. In this meeting it was proposed that all communists should be arrested. The delegates were amazed. However, the organizers of the mutiny made the completely baseless and hysterical claim that armed communist detachments were about to surround the meeting and arrest everyone. Therefore, it was supposedly justified and necessary to immediately, quickly begin rounding up and arresting all the communists. Quickly arrest them, they're coming to get us. This type of fear propaganda was cleverly used by the mutineers. Delegates had no time to think, they had no access to information, and communists had no chance to speak. Thus, the reactionaries could basically push through their anti-communist policy. Avrich writes, quote, "The Bolshevik commissar barely had time to object to the irregular proceedings before being cut off by the so-called military specialist in charge of artillery, former Tsarist general named Kozlovsky. 'Your time is past,' Kozlovsky declared." Unquote. Then the adventurer, anarcho-syndicalist, and would-be white guardist Petrichenko declared that a so-called Provisional Revolutionary Committee, or PRC, has been elected. This PRC would now take over in Kronstadt. Introduction to the collection of primary source documents called Kronstadt Tragedy states, quote, "The chair of the meeting, Petrichenko, quieting down the meeting, announced that the Revolutionary Committee declares all communists present are to be seized and not to be released until the situation is clarified." Unquote. Avrich also mentions the same incident. He says, quote, "Suddenly a voice from the floor shouted that 15 truckloads of communists armed with rifles and machine guns were on their way to break up the meeting. The news had the effect of a bombshell, throwing the delegates into alarm and confusion. It was this bogus report that communists were preparing to attack the meeting that actually precipitated the formation of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee. Petrichenko himself took up the rumor and announced that a detachment of 2,000 communists were indeed on their way to disperse the meeting. Once again, pandemonium broke loose, and the delegates left the hall in great excitement." Unquote. Using skillful propaganda and deception, Petrichenko claimed that the Provisional Committee was elected by soldier delegates. However, this was simply a lie. No election of such a kind had ever taken place. But the masses didn't know that. After all, maybe their delegates in their meeting had elected such a committee. Who could say? This is a good example of how this type of reactionary coup can happen. The Provisional Revolutionary Committee, or PRC, was never elected. Its members had already been chosen beforehand, and in fact, the committee was already sending orders and messages one day before it was supposedly elected. So that's pretty interesting. The committee stated, quote, "The Communist Party is removed from power. The Provisional Revolutionary Committee is in charge. We ask that non-Communist Party comrades take control into their hands." Unquote. Avrich also mentions how the Provisional Revolutionary Committee was not elected, although he says that it was just, quote, "for lack of time to hold elections," unquote. But we know that the Provisional Revolutionary Committee was actually created already beforehand, and there was never any intention of electing it. This Provisional Revolutionary Committee, despite the name, actually consisted of opportunists, capitalists, and counter-revolutionaries. 2 members of this committee were Mensheviks, who had opposed the October Revolution. Mensheviks and their foreign supporters believed that Russia needed capitalism and that Russia wasn't ready for a workers' revolution. Therefore, the workers' revolution needs to be defeated and capitalism needs to be restored. Ivan Oreshin, another member in the committee, was part of the capitalist Cadet Party, one of the leading parties under the Tsar. The head of the committee was the would-be white guardist Petrichenko. The chief editor of the Kronstadt Mutiny's newspaper, Sergei Putilin, was also a supporter of the capitalist Cadet Party. Thus, both the political leadership of the Kronstadt Mutiny and the mutiny's propaganda outlet were under the control of counter-revolutionaries. A genuine revolution is not led by anti-revolutionary Mensheviks or by capitalists. It just seems highly unlikely that some kind of genuine, truly socialist revolution would be carried out by Mensheviks and capitalists. Okay? Instead, from their actual political positions, capitalists obviously wanting to restore capitalism, and Mensheviks also thinking that Russia is not ready for a workers' revolution, therefore capitalism needs to be restored. It makes more sense to think that these guys would be in favor of overthrowing the revolution. So already from its very inception, the Kronstadt Mutiny was basically counter-revolutionary. However, that was just the beginning. It was important for the leaders of the Kronstadt Mutiny to appear like they were some kind of revolutionaries. And they fooled a lot of people, and they even apparently continue to fool people to this very day, because some people still prefer to believe that those guys were some kind of revolutionaries. Other members of the PRC were a black market speculator, Vershinin, a former police detective named Pavlov, 2 ex-capitalists or property holders, Baikov and Tukin, and about them Avrich writes, quote, who had once owned no less than 6 houses and 3 shops in Petrograd. And he continues, another committee member, Kilgast, had reportedly been convicted of embezzling government funds in the Kronstadt Transportation Department, but had been released in a general amnesty on the 3rd anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Unquote. Further, he says, quote, Perepelkin may have been the only reputed anarchist among the rebel leaders, but he was in a good position to propagate his libertarian views. However, the sailors, for their part, never called for the complete elimination of the state, a central plank in any anarchist platform. Unquote. The mutiny really was a loose conglomeration of all kinds of reactionaries and opportunists and adventurists, and not purely anarchist in any traditional sense. Even Petrichenko, if he was some kind of anarcho-syndicalist, he seems to have been quite eclectic in his views. The mutiny leaders needed to gauge the mood of the soldiers and try to fool them. Leader of the mutiny, would-be White Guardist Petrichenko, made the proposal to allow full freedom for quote-unquote all socialist parties in the public meeting of March 1st. Immediately he was attacked by angry shouts by soldiers, quote, that's freedom for the right SRs and Mensheviks. No, no way. We know all about their constituent assemblies. We don't need that. Unquote. Petrichenko needed to be very careful not to alienate his crowd. The cadet Ivan Oreshin, who was also part of the PRC, wrote, quote, the Kronstadt Uprising broke out under the pretext of replacing the old Soviet with a new one. The question of extending the vote also to the bourgeoisie was carefully avoided by the orators. They did not want to evoke opposition among the insurgents. They did not speak of the Constituent Assembly, but the assumption was that it could be arrived at gradually. Unquote. So the mutiny leaders understood that the soldiers didn't actually support their goals, so they needed to keep their true goals as secret. They thought they could be achieved gradually, by sneaky, secret maneuvering. During all these operations, the reactionary organizers of the mutiny still carefully tried to use a cover of revolutionary and pro-worker language. They called each other comrades, and they called themselves the Revolutionary Committee, etc., etc. However, they were adamant that the communists must be crushed. The vaguely anarchistic ideology, most likely influenced by Petrichenko, suited their purposes very well. All kinds of demagogical slogans were made about freedom from Bolshevik tyranny, Soviets without communism, etc., etc. Even if we didn't know, which of course we do, but even if we didn't know that Petrichenko had wanted to be a White Guardist, it was still completely obvious that the Kronstadt mutineers were not following anarchist theory in any typical sense. They were not establishing a stateless society, but an anti-communist military dictatorship. 300 communists were rounded up and thrown into prisons, but hundreds of communists also managed to run away. Quote, the repression carried out by the PRC against those communists who remained faithful to the communist revolution fully refutes the supposedly peaceful intentions of the rebels. Virtually all the minutes of the PRC sessions indicate that the struggle against the communists still at large and against those still in prison remained an unrelenting focus of their attention. At the last phase, they even resorted to threats of field court-martial in spite of their declared repeal of the death penalty. Unquote. An anarchist thug named Shustov was the commandant of the prison. Now, imagine being an anarchist and advocating the abolition of all prisons, but at the same time you're literally a prison warden and you keep arresting hundreds of communists. I wonder if they arrested any capitalists. We'll see. Shustov was also chosen as the executioner, who would start shooting the leading local communists. And there was even a plan to carry out a mass killing. Kronstadt 1921 states, quote, "Early on the morning of March 18th, Shustov set up a machine gun outside the cell which contained 23 prisoners. He was prevented from slaughtering the communists only by the advance of the Red Army across the ice." Unquote. Now, the Kronstadt mutiny had these political demands, and sometimes people talk about the demands. Lenin pointed out that the Kronstadt demands were quite vague and unclear, and this was inevitable because they were not realistic policy proposals, but a combination of utopianism, spontaneity, and demagogic propaganda intended to gather enough support until the White Guard could take power and crush the communists and all other opposition. So, maybe really deeply analyzing these demands is not really worth it. Who even knows if any of these demands would have been carried out, but let's take a look at them anyway. So, the essential demands were basically 1. New elections to the Soviets. In Kronstadt, the communists were arrested and thus would not be allowed to run in elections. So, nice one. Instead, the Soviets would be filled with Mensheviks, White Guardists, anarchists, and other opponents of the October Revolution, such as the SR Kerensky types. Of course, the reactionaries also hoped that this could spread elsewhere and thus help to destabilize the Soviet government as a whole. Needless to say, this would not have been some kind of anarchistic stateless system. 2. Full freedom of action for anti-communist parties, including the left SR terrorists who tried to assassinate Lenin in 1918, and they actually came very close because the terrorist's bullet hit Lenin in the neck, but he still survived. The demand was that these anti-communist forces should be given full freedom of action, but of course, in Kronstadt the communists would be repressed and prevented from all activism, and again the reactionaries hoped that this would spread everywhere. Thirdly, there should be no government regulation of trade unions. Of course, in practice, this simply meant that the unions should denounce the Soviet government, sever their ties with the Soviet government, and not follow instructions from the Soviet government. If this demand was implemented, it would lead to absolute chaos, because the unions were the government's main instrument of economic management and workplace democracy. The demand for unions which wouldn't collaborate with the workers' government was also an essentially anti-socialist demand. Unions working with a proletarian state are an important part of planned economy and socialist construction. Fourth, anti-communist rebels like Menshevik saboteurs, SR terrorists, and those who were organizing revolts should be freed from jail. Fifth, the mutineers demanded bigger rations. Now, this is what we call, stupidity, but we also call it populism. They advocated a system where everybody would get the exact same rations. Now, on paper, that sounds quite nice and beautiful and egalitarian, but it wasn't realistic. The Soviet government needed to give bigger rations to skilled experts and scientists who were impossible to replace but were still absolutely essential. Those experts were from bourgeois origins and they had gotten used to a comfortable life, and they would absolutely refuse to work with the Bolshevik government unless the Bolsheviks essentially bribed them, because they were anti-communist, they were reactionaries. But those were the only experts that existed in the country. The vast majority of the workers and peasants were illiterate, they couldn't even read, let alone have some kind of high education. The Bolsheviks also gave people who were in more critical and more important sectors higher rations, because remember, this is a time of scarcity, so those people who are maintaining absolutely vital functions of society and are in the most important sectors of production, they need to be ensured good rations. Of course, it's easy to get popularity if you tell the people who aren't getting as much, because the whole country is basically cold and hungry, there just isn't enough stuff to go around, and only the most important sectors are getting the resources. It's easy to get popularity if you tell people, oh, we'll just give you more stuff. But is that realistic? No, it's not realistic. And it's even more effective if you lie to people and you say, oh, actually the government has tons of stuff, there's no real scarcity, actually they just have tons of stuff, they're just keeping it all for themselves, because they're evil. 6. The abolition of so-called war communism or grain requisition. Again, this demand could gain some popularity because the peasants never particularly liked the system of war communism. War communism basically meant that the peasants farm the land, the government gives the peasant part of the product that they farm to eat, and then the government takes the rest of it to give to the military and to give to the cities. And the peasants didn't really like that. They would have wanted to control their product themselves, do whatever they want with it, probably sell it on the free market to get more money. But war is war, so, you had to do war communism. The mutineers, more broadly, also demanded that the peasants should be able to use their land and their property exactly how they saw fit. They did not want collective agriculture or socialist planned economy, but instead, whoever was lucky enough to have land should use it to the best of their ability and compete on the market. And landless peasants would remain landless, and big peasants would, get bigger, and small peasants would get smaller, because that's how the free market works. 7. The mutineers demanded the purging of communists from the military and also from factory management, and abolition of communist political departments from the army. Now, the army at this point still had very large numbers of professional officers and soldiers from the times of the Tsar and Kerensky. These officers were needed and used by the communists because of their skills and professional military training. However, because those officers and soldiers were not communists or workers, and were generally right-wing and untrustworthy, the Bolsheviks invented the political commissars to supervise the officers. So the Tsarist officers, the professional officers, they know all about soldier stuff, so they can do that, but the political commissar watches over them and makes sure that, they obey orders. Avrich writes about this, quote, former imperial officers were used as military specialists under the watchful supervision of political commissars. In this way, badly needed command experience and technical knowledge were provided until a new corps of Red commanders could be trained. Unquote. The Kronstadt mutineers demanded that this system be abolished. One can only imagine what the results would have been. The non-communist officers inside the Red Army would no longer follow socialist instructions, and the Red Army would basically stop being a proletarian army at all. In fact, this actually pretty quickly happened in Kronstadt, and the old Tsarist officers, like General Kozlovsky, Vilken, and some other, were soon walking around like they were all of a sudden masters of the situation, and in fact, they were masters of the situation during the mutiny. According to the SRs, the White Guard General Kozlovsky was elected to the Defense Council of the Kronstadt Mutiny, but it seems unlikely that a White Guard General could have gotten elected to such a position. It's more likely that he was simply chosen to the position by the mutiny leaders. I mean, they claimed that the Provisional Revolutionary Committee was elected even though that wasn't elected either, so it seems like they're just doing the same thing here with the White Guard General Kozlovsky. The Menshevik newspaper Sozialistische Westnik, published in Germany, wrote that Kozlovsky and the other whites tried to convince the Mensheviks and the SRs to begin a general military assault against the Soviet government, but they were unable to convince them. The Mensheviks then wrote afterwards, quote, the political leaders of the insurrection would not agree to take the offensive, and the opportunity was let slip. Unquote. White Guards and capitalists in Kronstadt. White émigrés immediately began making plans to join the Kronstadt mutineers. A former associate of White General Denikin, N.N. Chebyshev, wrote about those times. He says, quote, White officers roused themselves and started seeking ways to get to the fight in Kronstadt. The spark flew among the émigrés. Everybody's spirit was lifted by it. Unquote. Imperialist France and Britain encouraged capitalist states on the Russian border to assist the Kronstadt mutiny. British Foreign Minister Lord Curzon sent a secret message to Finland on March 11th stating, quote, "His Majesty's government are not prepared themselves to intervene, very confidential. There is no reason, however, why you should advise the Finnish government to take a similar course, or to prevent any private societies or individuals from helping the mutiny." Unquote. Food and money also came from rich capitalists and white emigres to support the Kronstadt mutineers. The Tsarist Baron P.Y. Vilken, the former commander of the Sevastopol battleship, used his spy contacts to deliver the money. His telegrams discuss sending the funds through Helsinki, Finland, quote, "which needs the money in the beginning of March," unquote. Quote, "The Russian banks, with the former Tsarist Minister of Finance, Kokovtsev, at their head, began to collect money for Kronstadt. Guchkov, the head of the Russian Imperialist Party, got in contact with the English and American governments to obtain food supplies," unquote. These food supplies were then later delivered to Kronstadt from Finland with the collaboration of the Finnish Secret Service. Avrich basically confirms all these facts. He writes, quote, "The Russian Union of Commerce and Industry in Paris declared its intention to send food and other supplies to Kronstadt. An initial sum of 2 million Finnish marks had already been pledged to aid Kronstadt in, quote, the sacred cause of liberating Russia," unquote. And, quote, "The Russian Asiatic Bank contributed 225,000 francs. Additional funds were donated by other Russian banks, insurance companies and financial concerns throughout Europe, and by the Russian Red Cross, which funneled all collections to Tseidler, its representative in Finland. By March 16th, Kokovtsov was able to inform the Committee of Russian Banks in Paris that deposits for Kronstadt already exceeded 775,000 francs," unquote. The leaders of the Kronstadt mutiny published an article on March 6th where they claimed to oppose the whites. However, this was just more deception, as Petrichenko and many of his associates were actually white guardists or associated with them. 2 days later, on March 8th, they welcomed a secret delegation of their allies, which included a courier from the SR Administrative Center, an agent of the Finnish capitalist State Security, 2 representatives of the monarchist Petrograd Combat Organization, and 4 White Guard officers, including Baron Vilken himself. The Whites were disguised as a Red Cross delegation sent from Finland. According to a detailed report by White Guardist Tseidler to his headquarters, the delegation was immediately invited to a joint session of the Kronstadt Provisional Revolutionary Committee and the General Staff officers. A plan was then reached to use the Red Cross as a cover to organize sending food, supplies and funds to Kronstadt by these White Guardists, Finnish state security agents, and the rest of them. Keep in mind that the Finnish capitalist state, which was actually conducting its own white terror at this exact time, keep in mind that they also had to collaborate with this to make it happen. The Kronstadt mutineers were in some good company. A White Guard emigre and former member of the Kronstadt mutiny's leadership, Kupolov, wrote later that some of the Kronstadt leaders, probably the Mensheviks and anarchists, were actually not too happy about the monarchist and White Guard plots. However, Petrichenko and his allies were simply using them and planned eventually to get rid of them too. Kupolov writes, quote, "The PRC, seeing that Kronstadt was filling up with agents of a monarchist organization, issued a declaration that it would not enter into negotiations with, nor accept any aid from, any non-socialist parties. But Petrichenko and the General Staff secretly worked in connection with the monarchists and prepared the ground for an overthrow of the committee," unquote. Now keep in mind that even if some people on the PRC said that they shouldn't accept aid from White Guardists and Imperialists and whatnot, and Petrograd Monarchist Combat Organization and stuff, they still ended up accepting the aid. And the anarcho-syndicalist Petrichenko was leading the whole thing. This is exactly why the Bolsheviks stated that while many of the Kronstadt mutineers were not White Guards or members of the capitalist class themselves, their actions still furthered the goals of the White Guard counter-revolution and of capitalist restoration. The White Guards were simply using these Mensheviks and hapless opportunists. The PRC claimed, quote, "In Kronstadt, total power is in the hands only of the revolutionary sailors, not of the White Guards, headed by some General Kozlovsky, as the slanderous Moscow radio proclaims. We have only one general here, Commissar of the Baltic Fleet, Kuzmin, and he has been arrested," unquote. So they claim that the Bolshevik Commissar Kuzmin was supposedly the only general there, which is a complete lie. Everybody now knows that Kozlovsky was there and a bunch of other white generals were constantly coming and going and running around like they owned the place. The mutiny leader, Petrichenko, later in exile, stated, quote, "Cut off from the outside world, we could receive no aid from foreign sources even if we had wanted it. We served as agents of no external groups, neither capitalists, Mensheviks, nor SRs," unquote. And these are just completely insane lies. Capitalists, Mensheviks, and SRs constituted the majority of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee itself, especially the SRs. The fact that they made agreements with the SR National Center, with white emigres, even a representative from the Finnish Secret Service, and that they were receiving tons of money, tons of food, tons of other kinds of aid from imperialist and white emigre sources is just so well documented that it's almost incredible that he would try to deny it like that. The Provisional Revolutionary Committee even sent 2 of its own members to Finland to ask for support and ask for aid from capitalist Finland. An anarchist sailor named Perepelkin, who was part of the Kronstadt mutiny, stated, quote, "And here I saw the former commander of the battleship Sevastopol, Baron Wilken, with whom I had earlier sailed, and it is he who is now acknowledged by the PRC to be a representative of the delegation that is offering us aid. I was outraged by this. I said, so that's the situation we're in. That's who we're forced to talk to. Petrichenko and the others jumped on me. There was no other way, they said. I stopped arguing, and I said I would accept the proposal. And on the second day, we received 400 poods of food and cigarettes. Those who agreed to mutual friendship with the White Guard Baron yesterday shouted that they were for Soviet power," unquote. Avrich writes, quote, "Any doubts about Wilken's motives, his officer background was known to the rebel leaders, were brushed aside, and the Revolutionary Committee accepted his offer," unquote. This type of stuff has of course continued to this very day. The pseudo-anarchists in Rojava, for instance, made the same exact type of arguments. They said that they needed to collaborate with the American imperialists, because American imperialists were giving them funding, training, military support, and weaponry. And were they really expected to win all on their own without such support? But such opportunistic logic merely reduces any movement into helpless puppets of the capitalists and imperialists. The unfortunate fact of the matter is that yes, you are supposed to win on your own, without being completely dependent on support from imperialists. The White General Rangel's right-hand man, White General von Lampe, literally laughed at the anarchists and Mensheviks and SRs. He wrote in his diary that their propaganda was, quote, "full of justifications to dispel the thought, God forbid, that the sailors were under the influence of white monarchist officers. The SRs don't understand that in such a struggle, what are needed are severe and determined measures," unquote. So it seems like, at least in his opinion, the SRs and Mensheviks were kinda not only trying to dilute their followers, but also diluting themselves. One of the editors for the mutiny's newspaper, Lomanov, stated, quote, "Up until the seizure of Kronstadt by Soviet troops, I thought the movement had been organized by the left SRs. After I became convinced that the movement was not spontaneous, I no longer sympathized with it. Now I am firmly convinced that without a doubt White Guards, both Russian and foreign, took part in the movement. The escape to Finland convinced me of this. Now I consider my participation in this movement to have been an unforgivable, stupid mistake," unquote. On March 15th, the Kronstadt mutineers secretly sent 2 of their leaders to Finland to ask for support. At this time, as I said, Finland was ruled by the ferocious White Guard government of Mannerheim and Company, which was conducting its own White Terror, launching invasions into Soviet Karelia and supporting Russian White generals. When the Kronstadt mutiny was being defeated, on March 17th, Petrichenko and the other leaders ordered the crews of ships Petropavlovsk and Sevastopol to blow up the ships and flee to anti-communist Finland. However, at this point the soldiers had basically had enough. They had begun to think that their leaders must be reactionaries. I mean, they had even seen the White Guard generals walking around, and they did not follow these orders. Instead, they rose up, they saved the ships, and arrested all the officers and provisional revolutionary committee members they could get their hands on. So, you could say that there was a mutiny against a mutiny. After the Kronstadt mutiny failed and its leaders had fled to Finland, they made an agreement to join the White Army of Rangel. So that is when they reached the absolute pinnacle of their counter-revolutionary treachery. Avrich writes, quote, "In May 1921, Petrichenko and several of his fellow refugees at the Fort Ino camp decided to volunteer their services to General Rangel in a new campaign to unseat the Bolsheviks and restore, quote-unquote, the gains of the February 1917 revolution, unquote. It's worth pointing out that at this point, since they were no longer in Kronstadt, they didn't need to pretend like they were supporters of the October Revolution. Hence, they now began to only praise the February Revolution of Kerensky. The Petrichenko gang and the white forces of Rangel agreed to, quote, the retention of their slogan, "All power to the Soviets but not the parties." The slogan was to be retained only as a, quote-unquote, convenient political maneuver until the communists had been overthrown. Once victory was in hand, the slogan would be shelved and a temporary military dictatorship installed, unquote. So if anybody is still wondering, are these guys agents of the whites? Well, now they have literally joined forces with White General Rangel, and they have agreed that, yeah, let's say we want Soviet power, but in reality we don't, and the whole point is to establish a military dictatorship, and after that, hopefully bourgeois democracy. But I'm sure Rangel wouldn't even have agreed to that. He would have wanted restoration of monarchy, so who knows how temporary the military dictatorship would have actually been. The reactionary propaganda campaign. The Kronstadt mutineers and their capitalist allies carried out a massive propaganda campaign to support the mutiny. They published lies claiming that supposedly the Bolsheviks were carrying out all kinds of atrocities and supposedly everybody was now rising up against them. In fact, nothing of the kind happened. The Kronstadt newspaper wrote on March 7th, quote, "Last-minute news from Petrograd. Mass arrests and executions of workers and sailors continue," unquote. Needless to say, no such mass executions were happening. The next day, on March 8th, a Finnish capitalist newspaper published the following lies, provided to them by Mensheviks. Quote, "Petrograd workers are striking. Crowds bearing red banners demand a change of government, the overthrow of the communists," unquote. On March 11th, the Kronstadt newspaper wrote, quote, "The Bolshevik government in panic. Our cry has been heard. Revolutionary sailors, Red Army men and workers in Petrograd are already coming to our assistance. The Bolshevik power feels the ground slipping from under its feet," unquote. The London Times reported, quote, "Moscow uprising reported. Petrograd fighting," unquote. Now, of course, there was no uprising in Moscow, there was no uprising in Petrograd, it was just Kronstadt. A French newspaper wrote, quote, "Petrograd and Moscow will be in the hands of insurgents who have formed a provisional government," unquote. Needless to say, that was completely false, never happened. And of course, a German newspaper also wrote about, quote, "the uprising in Russia," unquote. Quote, "Savinkov, Aid to Kerensky in his Warsaw newspaper Svoboda, printed on Polish capitalist government money, boasts on 24th of February, quote, "I fight against the Bolsheviks. I fight alongside those who have already struggled with white generals Kolchak, Denikin, Rangel, and even Petrichenko, strange as that may seem," unquote. The noteworthy thing about this one is that it was written a week before the Kronstadt mutiny actually began, so it demonstrates that it was orchestrated by the white emigres through their agents in Kronstadt. Savinkov also wrote that the sailors of Kronstadt had supposedly captured the battleship Aurora and fired its cannons on Petrograd. This never actually happened. He wrote, quote, "When the cruiser Aurora fired on Petrograd, it was an expression of repentance for the sin committed on 25th of October 1917 with the bombardment of the Winter Palace, the seat of Kerensky's ministry," unquote. So he's concocted this story that supposedly these are the same sailors as those who helped with the October Revolution, which is not the case, and that supposedly they've now repented of their support of the Bolsheviks and now they're using the battleship Aurora against the Bolsheviks instead of against Kerensky. Quote, "The Role of Berlin, the organ of the right wing of the Cadet Party, wrote, quote, 'The uprising of Kronstadt is scared because it is an uprising against the idea of the October Revolution,' unquote. The Society of Russian Industrialists and Financiers of Paris, when they heard the news from Kronstadt, decided not to worry about the extremist demands or the primitive cause of the mutiny, because its essential point was that, quote, 'the sailors were for the overthrow of the communist government,' unquote. The reactionary mutineers claimed that mass uprisings had broken out in Petrograd and Moscow to support the Kronstadt mutiny, but this was a complete lie. Even the Menshevik leader Dan admitted in his 1922 book that, quote, 'the Kronstadt mutiny was not supported by the Petersburg workers in any way,' unquote. So he admits that basically nobody outside Kronstadt supported the mutiny except, reactionaries. This is easy to understand because the mutiny was not based on any genuine political organizing among the workers or any genuine political program. It was simply a plot organized by White Guard reactionaries and political adventurers by spreading false rumors, lies, and exploiting the temporary difficulties and confusion in Kronstadt at the time in order to carry out basically a military coup to repress the communists and prevent the workers and peasants from understanding what was actually going on. And when they found out what was going on, when they saw that their leaders are shaking hands with a bunch of White Guard barons and they're running away to Finland, which was literally putting communists in concentration camps at that time, then the soldiers realized, what the F? So of course it was entirely unlikely that workers would support the Kronstadt mutiny in any other towns, where they could not simply be tricked by plotters, and where they actually had their working class and communist organizations. The Kronstadt mutiny used anarchists, left SR terrorists and Mensheviks as their henchmen, but even they were to a large extent simply fooled into it, as White Guardists were secretly trying to orchestrate many aspects of the mutiny for their own purposes. The exception to this, of course, is the anarcho-syndicalist Petrichenko, because he knew what was going on, but he still supported it. But that's not the case for all of the people involved. It is also worth pointing out that the best revolutionary elements in the left SRs, and in the left wing of the Mensheviks, and even among anarchists, had already seen the error in their ways and joined the Bolshevik Party, either right before the October Revolution or soon after it. You know, the left SRs actually helped the Bolsheviks carry out the October Revolution, and the best, most class-conscious elements in the left SRs already joined the Bolshevik Party before the left SRs degenerated into reactionaries. Only the worst elements, like terrorists, utopians, and the right-wing Mensheviks, opposed the Bolsheviks. Even the anarcho-syndicalist, so-called worker opposition, also supported the Bolsheviks in crushing the Kronstadt mutiny. So even they said that something like this mutiny cannot be tolerated. Soviets without communism, down with communism. Ideology of the Kronstadt Mutiny. Milyukov, one of the capitalist leaders of Russia who was ousted by the October Revolution, wrote in his newspaper, which was published in Paris, that reactionaries need to support the Kronstadt Mutiny. He therefore advocated the slogan, "Down with the Bolsheviks, long live the Soviets." The first step for him was to get rid of the Bolshevik communists. After that, it would be easy to restore the power of the capitalists. Quote, "The capitalist Milyukov supplied the Kronstadt Counterrevolutionaries with the watchword, 'Soviets without communists.'" Unquote. And Stalin also wrote about this, quote, "Soviets without communists, such was then the watchword of the chief of the Russian counter-revolution, Milyukov." Unquote. This next segment is from the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course, and I will read it because it's a pretty good summary of this whole situation. Quote, "But the class enemy was not dozing. He tried to exploit the distressing economic situation and the discontent of the peasants for his own purposes. Kulak revolts engineered by White Guards and SRs broke out in Siberia, the Ukraine and the Tambov province. All kinds of counter-revolutionary elements, Mensheviks, SRs, anarchists, White Guards, bourgeois nationalists, became active again. The enemy adopted new tactics of struggle against the Soviet power. He began to borrow a Soviet garb, and his slogan was no longer the old bankrupt 'Down with the Soviets', but a new slogan, 'For the Soviets but without communists.' A glaring instance of the new tactics of the class enemy was the counter-revolutionary mutiny in Kronstadt. White Guards, in complicity with SRs, Mensheviks and representatives of foreign states, assumed the lead of the mutiny. The mutineers at first used a Soviet signboard to camouflage their purpose of restoring the power and property of the capitalists and landlords. They raised the cry, "Soviets without communists." The counter-revolutionaries tried to exploit the discontent of the petty bourgeois masses in order to overthrow the power of the Soviets under a pseudo-Soviet slogan. Two circumstances facilitated the outbreak of the Kronstadt Mutiny: the deterioration in the composition of the ship's crews and the weakness of the Bolshevik organization in Kronstadt. Nearly all the old revolutionary communist Kronstadt sailors had been sent away to the front, heroically fighting in the ranks of the Red Army. The naval replenishments sent to Kronstadt to replace them consisted of new men who had not been schooled in the revolution. These were a perfectly raw peasant mass who gave expression to the peasantry's discontent with the grain requisition system and war communism. As for the Bolshevik organization in Kronstadt, it had been greatly weakened by a series of mobilizations for the front." Unquote. The latter part is significant because some anarchists will claim that the Kronstadt sailors must have been like super revolutionaries because they even helped in the October Revolution. They even had a role in the October Revolution. And since now there was a mutiny in Kronstadt, well, that must mean that, look, the supposedly best of the revolutionaries now mutinied because they saw how bad the Bolsheviks were. But that's a completely false narrative, and you don't even have to take my word for it. You don't have to take the word of history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks for it. You can instead listen to what the anarchist historian Avrich says. And he even cites Petrichenko, who was the leader of the whole mutiny and at least allegedly an anarcho-syndicalist. So anarchist historian Avrich writes that the bulk of the Kronstadt sailors currently present when the mutiny took place had actually fought in anti-communist forces before they got there. So that also must have contributed to the mutiny even happening, that these were generally very anti-revolutionary elements. He says, quote, "We have it from Petrichenko himself that 3/4 of the Kronstadt garrison were natives of the Ukraine, some of whom had served with the anti-Bolshevik forces in the south before entering the Soviet Navy." Unquote. Avrich writes, quote, "Throughout the Civil War of 1918-20, the sailors of Kronstadt, more than 40,000, replenished the ranks of the Red Army on every front." Unquote. So the original sailors were being sent all over the place away from Kronstadt. And he further says, quote, "There can be little doubt that during the Civil War years, a large turnover had indeed taken place within the Baltic fleet. Old-timers had been replaced by conscripts from the rural districts. By 1921, more than 3/4 of the sailors were of peasant origin, a substantially higher proportion than in 1917, when industrial workers from the Petrograd area made up a sizable part of the fleet." Unquote. Now, later on, he says that doesn't matter, but those are the facts, and in reality, it does matter. So, the temporary weakness of the local communist organization in Kronstadt, the mass influx of politically uneducated people from the countryside, who were, in the case of these sailors, even anti-communists, and the sending of the politically educated, experienced proletarians away from Kronstadt to the front lines during the war, all of these factors allowed the SR utopians, terrorists, anarchists, Mensheviks, and outright capitalist, monarchist, and white guards to gain a temporary foothold in Kronstadt. One of the reasons for the relative weakness of the Kronstadt Bolshevik party organization was that Trotskyists and Zinovievites were in a strong position there. Quote, "The work of political education was at that time badly organized in the Baltic fleet, and the Trotskyites managed to get into leading positions." Unquote. A power struggle began between the two opportunist factions of Trotsky and Zinoviev. At this time, Lenin had been waging ideological struggle against Trotsky's bureaucratic position on the questions of war communism and the role of the trade unions. Zinoviev took advantage of this to strengthen his own opportunist faction. The Trotskyists themselves admit this. They say, quote, "Seizing on Trotsky's wrong-headedness, Zinoviev mobilized his own base in the Petrograd-Kronstadt area against Trotsky. Zinoviev opened the floodgates of the Kronstadt party organization to backward recruits, while encouraging a poisonous atmosphere in the inner party dispute. The rot in the Kronstadt Communist Party organization was a critical factor in allowing the mutiny to proceed." Unquote. Of course, a few years after that, the renegade cliques of Trotsky and Zinoviev would unite their forces against the Bolshevik party leadership. Avrich writes, quote, "The authority of the party was further undermined by a struggle for political control in the fleet, which pitted Trotsky, the war commissar, against Zinoviev. As a result of this dispute, the commissars and other party administrators lost much of their hold over the rank and file." Unquote. Anti-Semitism. Another piece of information indicating that the Kronstadt mutineers did not represent the best revolutionary elements, but actually some of the worst, most politically backward elements, was their rampant anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, of course, was not rare in Russia at that time, but it was not tolerated among the communists, and it was more common among peasants than among workers. Avrich writes, quote, "Feelings against the Jews ran high among the Kronstadt sailors, many of whom came from the Ukraine and the western borderlands, the classic regions of virulent anti-Semitism in Russia." Unquote. One of the Kronstadt newspaper editors, who was an SR named Lamenov, said that people constantly wrote anti-Semitic articles about the Jews having, quote-unquote, "murdered Russia," but he says that he usually succeeded in preventing them from being published. Avrich writes, quote, "Vershinin, member of the PRC, shouted an appeal for joint action against the Jewish and communist oppressors." Unquote. Quote, "Jews were a customary scapegoat in times of hardship and distress. In a particularly vicious passage, one sailor attacks the Bolshevik regime as the, quote-unquote, First Jewish Republic. He labels the Jews a new privileged class, calling the government ultimatum to Kronstadt the ultimatum of the Jew Trotsky. These sentiments, he asserts, were widely shared by his fellow sailors. Witness the appeal of Vershinin, a member of the Revolutionary Committee, on March 8th. Quote, "Enough with your hurrahs and join with us to beat the Jews. It is their cursed domination that we workers and peasants have had to endure." Unquote. Why didn't the Bolsheviks negotiate a peaceful settlement with Kronstadt? Anarchists usually claim that the Bolsheviks saw the Kronstadt mutiny as some great threat to their power, that supposedly the heroic struggle of the mutineers could have inspired everyone to overthrow the Bolsheviks. However, this is completely false. Lenin wrote, quote, "This Kronstadt affair in itself is a very petty incident. It no more threatens to break up the Soviet state than the Irish disorders are threatening to break up the British Empire." Unquote. Now, as I already stated, the Menshevik leader Dan, for instance, already wrote in his book that, quote, "The Kronstadt mutiny was not supported by the Petersburg workers in any way," unquote. And there are countless other examples of this. The reactionaries and capitalists had to invent and fabricate tons of these instances of workers supposedly supporting the Kronstadt mutiny and rebelling against the Bolsheviks in Petrograd and Moscow and wherever, but all of those instances had to be fabricated because it wasn't true. If the Kronstadt mutiny inspired anybody, then it inspired the white emigres abroad. Avrich writes about this, quote, "What the authorities feared, in other words, was not so much the rebellion itself. Of greater concern to the Bolsheviks was the determination of the emigres, that's the white emigres, was the determination of the white emigres to gain access to Kronstadt and use it as a base for a landing on the mainland. This would have meant nothing less than a resumption of the Civil War." Unquote. The ice was quickly melting, so time was of the essence. Kronstadt had an extremely strong fortress and heavy weaponry, and it would be very difficult to attack, and if the ice melted, then the only way to get there would be on battleships. And Kronstadt itself had 2 battleships. Therefore, if the Bolsheviks waited and didn't attack and take the fort right away, then the resulting battle might be catastrophic in its casualties and material damages, as you can probably imagine. The mutineers also felt that they had gone too far and there simply was no turning back. They felt that they couldn't negotiate their way out of this one, and they simply had to fight as long as possible. Zinoviev carried out completely pointless negotiations with the mutineers, which achieved absolutely nothing and only allowed the counter-revolutionaries time to fortify their defenses. Quote, "Zinoviev negotiated with the traitors for 7 whole days, thereby giving them time to fortify themselves." Unquote. Trotsky's role in Kronstadt. It is often stated that Trotsky led the suppression of the Kronstadt mutiny and that under Trotsky's leadership the soldiers supposedly committed atrocities. However, both of these claims are false. The military defeat of the mutiny was entirely led by Voroshilov, and Trotsky himself wrote later that, quote, "The truth of the matter is that I personally did not participate in the least in the suppression of the Kronstadt rebellion." Unquote. The Red Army soldiers, 300 of whom had been delegates to the 10th Bolshevik Party Congress, acted completely heroically, but Zinoviev, who was in a power struggle with Trotsky at the time, spread all kinds of lies about the military operation, saying that it was organized by Trotsky and that all kinds of mistakes and wrongdoings supposedly occurred. But this was all just BS invented by Zinoviev. That said, the bureaucratic mistakes of Trotsky and neglecting ideological education in the army and navy, and the further sabotage by Zinoviev did contribute to the outbreak of the mutiny. Defeating the mutiny. Quote, "The mutineers gained possession of a first-class fortress, the fleet, and a vast quantity of arms and ammunition. Against the Kronstadt mutineers, the party sent its finest sons, delegates to the 10th Congress, headed by Comrade Voroshilov. The Red Army men advanced on Kronstadt across a thin sheet of ice. It broke in places and many were drowned. The almost impregnable forts of Kronstadt had to be taken by storm." Unquote. Quote, "Picked units of the Red Army were sent to crush the Kronstadt counter-revolution. The 10th Congress of the party, which was in session at that time, sent 300 of its delegates, headed by K.E. Voroshilov, to reinforce them. On March 16th, the revolutionary soldiers commenced an assault upon the main forts of Kronstadt, rushing forward in spite of continuous machine gun fire and the bursting shells which broke the already fragile ice over which they were advancing. In the front ranks of the assault columns was Voroshilov, setting an example of Bolshevik courage and valor.